You're what?
Right, welcome back, everyone. We have our next two meetings figured out. We're going to be meeting on December 12th here at the State House and by Zoom from 10 to 3. And then we will have an off-site meeting hosted by NECA on December 17th from 5 to 7. If you have requests for accommodations, please reach out to Mike and I. There'll be a press release coming out, and our contact information is on the committee webpage. There will be childcare and a spaghetti dinner as well. So we are going to pick back. I'm going to turn my agenda over. And talk about housing. Frank Mack from HHAV and I are both going to talk about this a bit. I was just reflecting and looking back over, and there's been a lot of stuff done, but it all feels like very little, a bunch of smaller things, and really not meeting the need. Frank, I don't know if you want to start with some general overview about where housing's at, and then I can talk a bit later just about the GA Emergency Housing Task Force and decisions we've made and what else we still have to decide in that group.
Yeah, that sounds good for sure. Jubilee, would it be helpful to go to talk about both from the homelessness side as well as the kind of housing needs side?
Yeah, and prior recommendations, both housing and, family homelessness.
Cool.
In Vermont.
Definitely. Well, hey, y'all. Frank Kanaki, I'm pronounced with the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont. So I'm sure y'all are aware of what's going on the ground across Vermont right now. So I can kind of talk about our work through kind of three buckets. One is the existing crisis around unhoused people across Vermont. One is around kind of the services we have in place and the services we need to maintain and expand to keep more people from becoming unhoused. And then the third is the solution, which is actually providing affordable housing to all the folks in Vermont in need. And starting on the kind of crisis point side around housing, emergency shelter, et cetera. Looking at the current data we have, on any given night, well over 3,500 unsheltered people in Vermont. And we have a statewide shelter capacity of about 550 households. And so obviously you take the big number, 3,500, put it next to 550 households of capacity, which is maybe, 700, 800, 900 individuals. There's a massive gap in our capacity in Vermont. And so, a number of years back, the legislature created the General Assistance Emergency Housing Program, commonly referred to as the Hotel Motel Program, as kind of that backstop. And we've seen that over the last few years get, cut. And so now, there's only a small subset of Vermonters who actually qualify for the GA program. And, up until this year, for the folks who qualified for the GA program, they were able to kind of utilize that program without any caps in terms of the number of nights they were eligible or the number of hotels, motels that the state would be willing to pay for. And this last legislative session, we even saw cuts to those. And so back in September, you may recall the GA emergency shelter caps went into effect of 80 nights in terms of the max number of nights that individuals who are the most vulnerable in Vermont would qualify. And then 1,100 rooms, which is the max cap of rooms available per night according to state law. And so we saw, hundreds and hundreds more Vermonters unsheltered or unhoused or unsheltered when those caps went into effect. And again, those are the most vulnerable. So those are seniors, people with disabilities, families, people fleeing domestic violence, et cetera. And so we have, as that data, I think, pretty clearly shows, quite a crisis on our hands. And so we have no more capacity on the ground with the shelter providers. service providers, more broadly in mental health, substance use, et cetera, are, stretched beyond capacity. And so it's really imperative that the state this upcoming year really take, I think, leadership and ownership of this issue and ensure that folks are sheltered going forward. That's going to be one of our main asks at HHEB this upcoming legislative session, is to ensure that folks who are unhoused in Vermont are at least able to get that stopgap of GA emergency shelter going forward, particularly those who are unhoused who meet that vulnerable criteria. The second bucket of issues are around services, and so these kind of look different, come across in a couple different ways. They can include like vouchers, direct cash transfers, housing navigators, and kind of positions at the various housing organizations and shelter organizations that help people navigate and stay in their homes. Those are really all funded or majority funded through the HOP program, through OEO, and through ERAP funds that are going to be expiring in June of this year. And so, it's really important as well that we continue to fund those programs, because those are the programs that are keeping the crisis of unhoused people from getting worse in Vermont. And then in terms of, solutions, we need to build more housing in Vermont. And I think we all know that the gap between people's wages and the cost of housing continues to spiral in the wrong direction. And people here just cannot afford to live here anymore. According to VHFA's most recent survey, I think it was around like 30,000 new homes needed to be built by 2030. So obviously we have quite a deep crisis that is going to cost a lot of money to be able to solve that crisis. And so it's really imperative that the state, raise the revenue and have the revenue they need to be able to address that crisis going forward. I think it's also, I think from our perspective, really important to intersect housing issues with food security issues, with environmental issues, with healthcare issues, and really kind of intersect that going forward, because, it's not just the cost of housing, but if we can actually address this crisis, it obviously has positive ripple effects across all aspects of Vermonters' lives and also business lives. They can recruit, build workforce, et cetera, oftentimes that are limited now because of the lack of access to housing for folks who they're trying to hire, particularly folks from out of state who are trying to move in and there's nowhere for people to go. I don't know, Julie, is that helpful, or anything in specific that you want me to cover that I didn't?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm interested in hearing, the VHIP, we hear it's creating all sorts of new apartments that are at least primarily either going to folks who are experiencing homelessness, or they're targeting certain income levels. I'm wondering if you are getting feedback around the state on how well that's actually serving these populations that are supposed to be prioritized. It's popular and it gets things online quickly, but is not, a permanent kind of option. So I'm just wondering what you think of the program.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely defer to some of the other folks who are, I think, more focused on that, like VHFA. But in general, I think we've heard positive things around. I mean, I think just to back up, we really need like an all hands on deck approach to this. There's no like one way to kind of build out or solve this crisis. So we need to have as many of these various programs in place as possible to kind of maximize our ability to get more units or more housing online for folks. That said, I think this is an important program from what we've heard on the ground. I think, but I think some of the issues with it, particularly around, the folks in prioritizing folks coming off coordinated entry, is that it's not necessarily the VHIP program, but, we just don't have services in place in communities that we need to be able to support people going into housing. And so, even if we are building units, if we're not providing services and supports for folks who are moving into those units who may have specific needs, it doesn't matter how many units we have, we're not going to be able to solve the crisis. So I think it's kind of connecting all of these dots together and recognizing we can't just build our way out. We need to have services, we need to have the supports as well going forward.
Thank you. Any other questions for Frank?
Jubilee, did you want me to mention the task force?
Yeah, I mean, you can if you want. I have printed out. I can talk about it too.
That sounds perfect. Sorry, I was planning on being in the room so I could coordinate this better with you, and had school delays this morning, so my kid didn't get up them up earlier.
Yeah, no. It's the first inclement weather event of the winter for us. So Frank and I are both on the GA Emergency Housing Task Force, which was established through the budget last year. And it's just a group of folks and we're trying to make recommendations about the GA Emergency Housing Program in general, and then also just recommendations for the legislature on how we address this crisis in our state. It's been interesting. The charges given to the group were a lot and very complex, and not a lot of time was given. And so I don't think we'll fully be able to answer a lot of them. So we've been prioritizing one around, the big one that's taken a lot is eligibility. It looks very similar to what was passed in the budget, but we did add a new category for transition age youth 19 to 24 who are exiting foster care or have been in state's custody. It's not a huge group of youth and transition age youth, but it's I think Jesse from YDP had told me it was about 72 probably currently who it would add to those who qualify. But we know that age group is so vulnerable, and that by investing in housing now, we can prevent a lot of harm in their futures. It's just a really there's a good return on investment. I hate using that about people, but it's really crucial for us to be lifting up this population. So we added that. We made sure that it's that when they talk about someone having a disability, that we're using the ADA definition. That wasn't so clear. And we also oh, yes. And we also worked with the Vermont Network to expand and work on the definition about fleeing domestic or sexual violence, because we were finding that people who were victims of domestic violence in the hotels were then getting periods of ineligibility. So just making sure that we're not causing more harm and those are the big things. There's some other areas. A big one is around income contributions. Currently, folks, they have any source of income. It's calculated, and then they have to do some self-pay nights before DCF starts contributing money towards and paying for the hotel room. I think we all agreed that we need to look at this, that having these kinds of things prevents people from being able to save for once they find permanent housing. We find the calculations aren't quite, so you're at the top of a percentage, you pay more of your higher percentage of your income than someone who may be lower. So there's a lot of issues. We couldn't settle on one path forward. So we're going to list a lot of different possibilities. Some of them were people pay half of their income contribution into the program, and then the other half into savings. Some were it all into savings. Some were that they get rid of them completely. So there's a lot of ideas, and we didn't have the time to really dig into it. So we're just going to recommend that the legislature really look into it, and give them some options. We also voted to recommend to eliminate the resource test. We don't, if folks have, I believe it's more than $80 in their bank account, they have to spend it before they can become eligible for this program. And so we know for families and for people just entering adulthood, or anyone really, that keeps people in poverty. So there was talked a bit about, because one of the eligibility categories is if you become homeless due to a natural disaster. And there was some talk about, people with millions of dollars in assets living in these hotels, but experience tells us that you have the resources to go somewhere else, that's where you're going to go. And so we want people to be hanging on to their bank accounts, their retirement accounts, because those are tools to fight against poverty. Some of the things we're going to still have yet to decide is really around the length of stay, the eligible days. We really wanted that to be data-based. So Frank will actually be presenting on that to us at our next meeting. And we expect to see much longer lengths that we recommend, and that's going to be based on the data. How long are people in hotels before they find housing? Just going through bits by bits. We talked a bit about like the notice and appeal process to make sure folks, if there's an issue, when it's time to renew, that they're getting adequate notice, and that they're getting adequate notice when there's big programmatic changes. It's like the program is constantly switching. And so, we already have limited services, and they're spending all of their time helping people renew and just stay housed that they can't find, work with folks to find permanent housing options. And what else am I? Oh, yeah. Frank had to hop off to another meeting, so I guess he won't be able. Yeah. So those are the kind of high level recommendations. We'll also be Frank, HHAV and the COC will be submitting information on what the data tells us about, what we need for shelters, what we need for permanent supportive housing, what we need for just regular housing to eradicate homelessness in Vermont. Yeah, so any questions on that part? Yes, Rita.
Hi, thanks. I guess I'm very concerned about not only the federal fiscal outlook, but the state fiscal outlook in terms of funding and priorities. And I'm wondering if there's a plan B for sheltering the homeless, maybe not in motel rooms in terms of lack of funding for that, but just kind of getting them out of the elements. Whether it's a large group setting, just some kind of fallback position in terms of, resources or lack of resources for them.
Yeah. I mean, we'll continue to have some cold weather shelters for those really cold days, and they pop up. The issue is the motel rooms are actually one of the cheaper options. People don't like it. There's a lot of work we can be doing to improve services and outreach. I think that's an investment that would have to be made. But I mean, if we're looking at the over 3 million just to house 17 families that the state, in Waterbury and Williston, it's opening up these short-term shelters is really expensive, oftentimes more expensive than the hotels. And for congregate shelter, it's not as expensive, but there's other costs. It's really harmful to people's mental health. The data shows they're not effective. I think they're okay for really extreme short-term situations, but if we want people, like Kay was saying, if we want people to thrive, those are not the types of places where that happens.
Thank you.
And so I think the long-term costs of doing that would far exceed just investing now. All of our other systems, including our towns and municipalities' budgets, the costs become much greater.
Do you know what the administration's position is on housing?
We have 3 members of appointed from various roles in the administration. And they have not brought any recommendations and have been abstaining from all votes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
A question that might not be answerable today.
Yeah.
I'm curious. So, I mean, I see all of these recommendations and all the
Yeah.
changes that were made, and it's really helpful to have it all laid out this way. And I have not been able to get a complete understanding of sort of all the different programs and how they support each other or the different requirements. And I'm just curious about like where the federal requirements and where the state requirements lie for different things. So I'm thinking about, you know, if Vermont were to try to lessen some of the administrative burdens and have more automatic renewals for certain folks, like, is that something that we could do, or is there federal, restrictions, or like if there's a family who is eligible for a voucher but requires a certain number of bedrooms because of their family makeup, but are willing to stay in a smaller space if one becomes available because it's a better setup than where they are, like in a one-room hotel room, like where's their flexibility and where are their hard rules around the shelter option for different folks? Makes sense?
Yeah, well, in terms of voucher, this is just something that's always been funny to me about HUD is HUD's occupancy standards are actually, if you want to challenge them, they're actually violate fair housing.
Okay.
Yeah, so if a family wants to live and if it's 2 parents and they have 4 children and they want to live in a 2-bedroom, they can appeal and it'll be overturned. The caveat to that is when there's when children are in state's custody and they may have their own rules about that. But I think but what you bring up something that's really important when you're reading through all of this, it's short little bits of one-time funding. And then, we have federal funding that comes in that helps to supplement a lot of things and is more regular, but even that is usually on 3-4 year grant cycles. And so service providers and agencies are constantly having to figure out how to put all of this together to best utilize their resources. And it's different every year based on what's available. So I think, we've got all of these things as we really need a vision, like a big picture, and to have all of these things kind of working together. Because I think this 5 million here this year, 2 million there next year is just not addressing the problem and is unsustainable. Both for our state and the crisis we're facing and for these organizations we're expecting to do the work in their communities. Jenna.
Thanks. I was just going to answer Amy's question as a housing provider and a shelter provider. We're following all the federal guidelines are going to the state who are releasing the housing opportunity program that Frank talked about, those funds which follow HUD guidelines. So we are following all those. And I think that people who are receiving those funds are doing the same. I think there's the opportunity to be more flexible when people are operating housing programs using philanthropic dollars or foundation funds. And then there's some creativity that happens in innovation that wrap around families in different ways. But for the rest of us, we're following the law that we're told, federal laws.
You also talked about renewals. That was one thing I forgot to add, is currently, Economic Services is doing renewals at least every 28 days, but if someone is paid weekly, they get a renewal each week, or if they're paid every 2 weeks, they have to renew every 2 weeks. And that requires a lot of staff, and it requires support case managers and people helping families stay housed to spend all of their time just renewing. So one of our other recommendations is moving to a different, I think there was like 9 months or 3 months or 90 days or 6 months. It'll kind of depend on what we end up deciding on our recommendations around lengths of stay. But we definitely recommend moving those renewals to create more space between when they happen, which will also reduce the administrative costs of the program. Right now they're having to use a lot of temporary workers, which are more expensive to be able to keep up with the administrative requirements for the program. So I think we actually save ourselves money there by doing that, and allow our, these households and their, systems of supports to spend more of their time actually working on getting them into a permanent situation. Okay. And then if folks are done talking about housing, we just have some time. We've heard from a lot of groups and topic areas. And I just wanted us to start thinking about priorities we see or trends we see when we start thinking about our recommendations for this next legislature. I think it's important to think about the areas that we're missing in the last recommendations, and then also thinking about what lies ahead. Our federal government may look and operate very differently. And so just thinking how we can protect and take care of the lives. So Karen, I see your hand.
Yes, thank you, Representative McGill. I have to leave the meeting early, but I did want to take the opportunity just to, and I will submit this to Katie. I did not before because I just looked at it last night and updated it, but I did have an update for some of the recommendations that I didn't see listed in micro development business program and the match savings and the VITA. And there are some, these very successful programs have been taken care of in the legislature during the COVID pandemic. The micro business development program, we ran a new program called Embrace through the micro business development program, which has existed since 1988. And we put $4.5 million in grants to micro businesses in the state. And there has been an increase. The legislature has increased our base funding by about $200,000 from about $300,000 in 2019 to $500,000 in currently. The match savings program has sort of is considered the financial capabilities program now Does everything from, you know, it's such an integral part of any kind of business proposition or, you know, economic security, whether they're saving, credit repair, access to finances, financial coaching. So that's a big part of what those programs do. And then the VITA program of the volunteer income tax, which Katie did update in that thing, is responsible for saving low-income Vermont taxpayers up to over $6 million in credits and taxes and returns and that type of thing. So I'm sure that those programs will be key again. In fact, that I know that Community Action that administers all of those programs will in fact be seeking some increases in those programs because they've been very successful for low-income Vermonters and have been for a long time and will continue to be. So I just wanted to mention that, and I'll submit that update to Katie, but I did have to leave probably early when you get to economic security.
Yes, thanks so much. Anyone else? Anyone have any priorities or recommendations that have come from groups that they're thinking about or excited about? You know, Amy and I were talking earlier this week, and we're realizing just recommendations around helping Vermonters living with disabilities and their families and support circles, making sure we're helping them to thrive and get the things and the services that they need. And so that's one I'm thinking about in my head, and hoping we can come with some strong ones. I think that's also, you know, a population I'm really worried about if our federal government does change drastically. It's one of those places where I'm afraid we're going to see a lot of gaps.
I think to follow up on that too, I really appreciate in the older iteration of the recommendations, that last catch-all category that was very specific to SNAP, but it talked about responding to urgent need and just asking the General Assembly to make every effort to find replacement funding for potential harm that could come from federal cuts. And I just think it would be worth spending some time talking about that more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in addition to the disability support, you know, the healthcare continuum of care is an area that will need some attention in upcoming years. And I think that children are better off than many of the other populations in the state because of our really strong Dr. Dinosaur program, but we do have a benefits cliff, and there is concern about like mental health supports, having enough capacity in the workforce and having support in schools. So I think that's another area that could use some attention. And then the last one, or not the last one, but one other one I have on my list is around getting cash to families. And we'll be talking about that this afternoon with the economic supports piece. But you know, if one of our big focuses is poverty, it seems like if we can get some more cash to families through tax credits and our Reach It program and other things, then we could accomplish some of our goals.
Olivia.
Yeah, I'll tag on to Amy's comment, just that I was very struck by one of the slides that Matthew Bernstein showed about the like very direct and even temporal connection between just cash to families and then their involvement with the child welfare, at least reports and investigations. So not to suggest that we shouldn't be prioritizing other DCF, you know, priorities that he raised, but it seems like some of that upstream funding could touch on a lot of the other different priorities that we might want to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. I wrote down all of those figures, even though I knew he was going to send them, just because Yeah, that was truly, truly eye-opening, and to see such an amazing, just direct response to cash was something I hadn't seen. And I do think by doing that, we can address hunger, we can address housing. I follow just in my work with runaway and homeless youth programs. I've been following a lot of the pilot projects where they're giving cash to youth in precarious housing situations, and just the data all over is, when you give them that money, they resolve their homelessness, and they become stable. And it's just like every time. So it's where my mind has been a lot this past year. It's like one thing we can do that makes improvements in so many areas, including the number of calls being made for reports. That's we're not doing more of it. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes, Karen.
Just in addition to the cash assistance and reach up, which is something we should work on, I think there'll be a lot of discussion this year just because of the property taxes on, tax policy, especially for low income people, and whether we, continue to income sensitize certain things, and earned income tax credits, and all of those things that are available to give assistance to low income families. So I think we might want to include some of that discussion in our policy recommendations this year.
Agreed. And I have a feeling we may hear about some of that our next presenters. Yeah, or Seth, do you have any areas you're particularly interested in?
Well, I apologize, but our internet went out at the office, so I missed a chunk of that last conversation around housing. And I know that I had brought it up before, but certainly, I think that the housing intervention piece is a focal point. And I'm certainly, I think in our last meeting, I mentioned, I'm struck by the dynamic tension between, how do we do systemic fixes versus what are the intervention strategies that sort of help people who are on the ground today. And not that those are necessarily two different things, but they might necessitate sort of different thoughts around investment. And so certainly those upstream, however far upstream we can get, even if it doesn't have maybe the immediate impact, strikes me as, the long range goal, sort of, or charge of the group. And so I'm certainly interested in trying to take a look at those. But I would agree, there's going to be tremendous pressure this year on anything related to affordability, however you choose to define that. But that's going to be both cost and growth, and certainly trying to think about how we make the appropriate investments, so that we're in a better situation in the future, as opposed to maybe short-term intervention strategies.
I think for me, I could say all of the above, because, with my job, all of it is what I do and what I'm concerned with. So I don't necessarily have a specific priority other than to try to support and offer information as you need it on how trauma, resiliency, and thriving intersects with this work and the things that we're looking at recommending. Though I will say, and I don't necessarily think we need testimony, but I think though we might, one of the things we may want to consider is the effects of everything that is going on our workforce. It's not just lack of workforce, it's the stress and trauma faced by the workforce. Like I can tell you, like the support group I run for people working in housing, they're talking about, just what it feels like to be on the ground and working right now. And, there's just a lot going on, I think, for community partners as well as state employees who are trying to serve people and really struggling.
I'm glad you highlighted that earlier and now. It's something I see a lot in the field. We see turnover because of it, and a lot of people struggling. So yes, we need our workforce. So I think figuring out how we can support them in this really hard work, really challenging work, that I'm very grateful they show up for day after day, is going to be incredibly important.
It might be interesting on that front to get input from United Way's Working Bridges as well at some point. They certainly have quite a bit of direct interaction with employers and employees who are dealing, with a lot of family situations that are very related to what we're talking about.
Taking note of that, because I have a meeting with my local United Way very soon.
I don't see those as entirely distinct. So I think what I've heard from some folks who are working in support roles is that it is really difficult to not have the resources they need to offer to people. And so I think some of it is around like offering opportunities for people to take leave and to support, to have a better support structure for our caregiving economy. But I also think another piece of that is giving people the ability to meet the goals of their programs. And I think some of that does come from some of the other goals that we have.
Got a few more minutes left. If anyone has any other things, are there specific topics you would like to hear about for our next meeting, or things you'd like to dig in? And Jenna, yeah, I see your hand.
I don't really probably have a helpful comment. I don't know, just an awareness. I think like all we've heard, and we will continue to hear a lot of strategies that are hugely disconnected, right? Like they're disconnected on many levels from how they're funded, for who's eligible, or how they're implemented, where they're implemented. We heard a lot about best practices that we heard may or may not be implemented in the field. We're not sure. We've heard some high level recommendations. It's a lot. And as we sit around and navigate kind of the pieces parts of like, hey, what's going to move the needle? Think about it from the role of a participant who's kind of trying to get by every single day on these disconnected systems and structures. So I wonder, like, is there a way to like think about high level information gathering, and instead of really doubling down on a lot of disconnected things, I don't know, pulling something together that looks like, hey, a cohesive way to get information to people that says, hey, there's these 5 things that are out there that the state Vermont offers or available at your local, here's your local parent-child center. Here's what happens there. Here's your local community action. Like, here's what you're eligible for. I don't know. I'm just speaking up, thinking about all the things, because we have a lot of great things.
Yes.
Packaging's a little off.
I think that disconnectedness is just woven throughout our state. We see it even in our legislature and our committees. It's and I think figuring out how to stitch it all together in a real vision, is well, that's what we need to figure out, because I think it's not efficient, and I don't know how we can tackle everything if we don't figure out how to do it together. Is Steph? Oh, I didn't scroll down. Okay. Well, we will continue this conversation. Now we're going to get to the economic part of the recommendations, and then we also have Public Assets Institute here to present to us as well. Julie, do you want to come join us? Amy and I are all alone. If you want to come join us at the table so they can hear you better. And I see Steph is on Zoom.
Hi, everyone. Are you ready for us to just dive in? I think I'm.
Yeah, take it away.
Okay, I think I, as usual, have charts, so I will share my screen if that's okay. And I think I also shared them with Mike, so you may all have access to them already.
Yes.
Oh, hang on, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Co-host. There you go.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Steph Yu, the Executive Director of the Public Assets Institute. Some of you have participated in some of our economic security convenings this fall, and I know we've worked with a lot of you in various capacities over the years. So I want to kind of keep this short and then happy to have a conversation or questions, whatever works for everyone. And Julie will have a few minutes to just kind of talk about some of the work that she's doing. But like I say, some of you may have heard some pieces of this before, but we've been sort of thinking about, I think maybe touching on what you all were just talking about a little bit, how to think about economic security more holistically and kind of stitching all the patchwork pieces together into more of a coherent whole. So, we've just been trying to bring together partners and advocates and thinking about this. And we sort of put together this kind of quick presentation to just talk about sort of the pieces that we're looking at and where we're seeing the kind of weaknesses in the system. So just real quick, my goal is to kind of just talk about how Vermonters are doing from an economic perspective, acknowledging that a lot of our sort of classic economic indicators aren't necessarily very helpful in telling us how Vermonters are doing, and yet they're paid attention to by all of you, by policymakers, by sort of the media in terms of how we think about the economy. But then how do we connect that to how real people are doing? And that's sort of what we've been working on, well, for a long time, but particularly, with a particular emphasis on the last few months and couple of years, really. So my goal today is really to talk about, like I say, some of these classic economic indicators, and then what we look at public assets to really kind of dig a little more into how Vermonters are doing, and then talk a little bit about the state budget and how these things show up in the state budget and where the concentration of them, of some of the economic security tools are. So with that, I'll kind of launch in and then hand it over to Julie. And then, like I say, we're happy to take questions or, send follow-up, whatever works for all of you. So we've really been thinking about the promises that we make in statute in Vermont. So that's health, housing, dignified work, education, food, social security, and a healthy environment. This is the people's budget language that we have in statute in Vermont. And the law requires that our spending and revenue policies address that list of needs, those 7 needs. And I think we're closer on keeping some of these promises than others, but Vermonters are struggling in all of these areas. So again, we've sort of just been thinking about how to kind of stitch these things together and think about them holistically. We know some of what works. We saw some evidence of that during a lot of the pandemic aid. And we know we have the resources to keep these promises, but I think it involves more thinking differently about what makes life affordable for Vermonters and what government's role should be in that. So again, I'll just kind of talk a little bit about some of these classic economic indicators that people focus on, and then a little bit on the state budget. And I do think that some of these indicators don't necessarily say a lot about what people are experiencing and sort of the reality of their lives. But, from a classic kind of from a classic sort of economic perspective, Vermont's doing pretty well. So one of the things that people look at is median household income, which Vermont had the biggest growth from 2022 to 2023. And not only that, but actually had the biggest growth among all states from 2019 to 2023. We're still kind of in the middle of the pack on that, maybe inching a little higher, but and again, the median doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of everybody sort of across the board. It's not like it's shared equally, but as an indicator, it's definitely moving in the right direction. And like I say, we're seeing the biggest growth among states. And we have one of the lowest unemployment rates in states. And that's not just looking at kind of the classic unemployment, which looks at people who are unemployed and actively looking for work, but it also includes by the bigger measure, which includes people who are unemployed and have given up looking for work, as well as those who are considered underemployed, meaning that they wish they were working more hours than they are. And by either of those measures, we have one of the lowest unemployment rates of all the states. So doing pretty well. And then I think to kind of, and I think there's also a question about, there's definitely jobs available. We know there's a lot of demand for workers. Are those jobs quality jobs? Do those jobs pay well? Those are sort of some of the questions that I think we kind of have to dig into a little bit more. And from the perspective of wage growth, we have seen more growth at the lower end of the wage scale over the last few years. We're working on the new version of this chart, but it looks pretty similar, which is at sort of at the 10th percentile, sort of the low wage end, we're seeing faster growth and somewhat keeping up with inflation. But I think it's important to keep in mind that that is after decades of relatively stagnant, movement on the low end of the wage scale, so that the buying power of people at the low end of the wage scale is still less than what it was 30 years ago. And we also know, there's lots of areas of real economic stress, and that some of the sort of temporary aid from COVID, once that went away, that it left people worse off because the need hasn't necessarily gone away. So things like some of the housing supports, the increased food aid, the cash in people's pockets through stimulus payments, and the increased unemployment, all of that stuff was useful. And now with it gone, again, a lot of that need is still remaining. So one of the ways that Public Assets evaluates how Vermonters are doing is really using the state's own measure. I'm sure you've all seen the Basic Needs Report. So every 2 years, the state puts out this report and really assessing what it takes for different family types to afford their basic needs here, whether a single individual or a family, whatever it might look like. And every year we look at what share of Vermonters are really struggling to afford their basic needs. And I think it's worth pointing out, although I know this group knows well, that the cost of basic needs is much higher than the poverty level. A lot of our programs are tied to the poverty level or some sort of multiple of the poverty threshold. And sometimes the basic needs number is, 3 or 4 times what that poverty level is. So really thinking about it, if we treated the basic needs as where we wanted to be, we'd be looking at a higher number than when we're rooting it all sort of in the poverty threshold. But what we found in 2023 was that more than half of single adults, so on this side of the chart, more than half of them couldn't make ends meet, and that's whether with kids or without kids, right? So, and even on this sort of 2-earner end, we're seeing a fair amount of struggle, right? 1/4 to 1/5 of 2-earner households still falling short, and it's really both a wage problem and a cost problem. I think a lot of on the cost side is the housing concerns. So we've seen this immediate crisis, a lot of vulnerable families losing shelters. We know that housing prices, whether to rent or buy, have gotten out of reach for a lot of Vermonters. So I know you all have seen, I'm sure you all have talked about, sort of the increase in the unhoused population. Again, acknowledging that this is a point in time count in January when there is seasonal shelter available. So the sheltering numbers don't reflect what's been happening over the summer and fall. But to just see that, that count has really essentially doubled since pre-pandemic. And some of that's probably people being counted, and some of that is definitely a real increase. So, and then of course, just the cost of housing. So again, to rent or to buy, more and more people in unaffordable housing, whether they're renting or buying. And we're, even though the sort of inflation roller coaster that we've all been on has resulted in higher food prices. Again, some wages are keeping up, but that doesn't mean there can still be a mismatch, right, between somebody's particular job and their kind of cost picture and whether or not they're able to keep up with their costs. And on the wage side, this has been a persistent problem, right, on the wage side. So even though there has been some growth on the low end of the wage scale, from an average perspective, Vermont's always had this mismatch where our prices tend to be pretty average, and that's setting aside the cost of housing in sort of the Chittenden County, Northwest Vermont area. Our prices are pretty average relative to the US average, but our wages are low. Our wages tend to be about 80 to 85% of the US average. So you can sort of see where that mismatch is, and it's really more on the wage side than it is on the cost side. And of course, there's always racial disparities and a racial component to a lot of these economic indicators and sort of economic security, knowing that as long as we've been tracking poverty by race, that Vermonters of color are much more likely to be in poverty, particularly Black Vermonters, which again is not particular to Vermont, but is true across the country, and that there's also these sort of racial disparities along property ownership lines and an increasing wealth gap. True both in Vermont, that sort of trend in the whole country holds up in Vermont as well. So I want to give a very quick overview of state budget, just not because you all don't know all this already, but because I think sometimes it helps to just have that visual fresh and kind of the relative weight of things in your mind. So this is just looking at the size of the state budget, showing the COVID bump for the COVID, temporary pandemic aid, but then also showing that, since pre-pandemic, we've seen an increase both in the federal and the state to the tune of, the state budget was about 6 billion pre-COVID, now about 8.6. Again, a pretty big bump in the federal piece even after the COVID relief has gone away. And I think part of the reason we want to point this out is just acknowledging what we as a state have control over and what we don't have control over, right? When federal dollars come to us, they come to us for a particular program or a particular, there might be some flexibility within that program, but it's for a particular purpose, and we don't necessarily have total control over that slice of the budget. And again, these just some quick visuals just to kind of have fresh sort of the relative size of things. So how does the state budget, what do we spend money on in the state budget? Two biggest things are public education and healthcare. They're each about a third. So all the things that we think of kind of as the economic security tools are really a relatively small slice of the budget. Like everything that's not public education and healthcare adds up to that last third. And then what we think of as really those sort of individual well-being supports and our housing investments that really kind of get to people's economic security and kind of those like right to the bottom line of the household budget, really about 10% of the state budget, right? A relatively small share. And we're calling this whole thing individual well-being supports, but that includes a lot of these programs that you all are familiar with, Reach Up, 3 Squares, some of the supports for Vermonters with disability, utility assistance, all that kind of stuff is included here, childcare, and really talking about 10% of the state budget. And housing investments really adding up to about 170 million. Acknowledging that not all dollars that go to families or go to Vermonters are flowing through the state budget. Julie's going to talk a little bit about tax credits, which don't show up in the state budget, but show up as a tax expenditure. So, this isn't a comprehensive list, but it's more to just kind of give a sense of the relative size of this thing, of these supports in the state budget. And again, I don't know that I need to spend a lot of time on the revenue side of things, but it's more just to talk about kind of the relative size of things. We talk about a 3-legged stool of revenue sources of state taxes, income taxes, consumption taxes, which includes, sales, meals and rooms, all those pieces. And then property taxes, although our school taxes are kind of a mix of property and income-based taxes, but you can kind of see the relative size of them. And we use all that to feed into this chart. I feel that for some people, this chart is really helpful, and for some people, it's incomprehensible. For me, what I would say is, like, the thing to take away from this chart is not to follow every single line, but to sort of see the relative weight of things. Where are the taxes coming from, and then what are we spending them on? And I think what it shows is that those two biggest chunks of the state budget, public education and healthcare, public education is almost all state dollars. Healthcare is about 2/3 federal dollars, and kind of all these other things are just a mix of federal and state dollars. And again, it's sort of the relative size of things and where the different taxes go to. So just to kind of, I think for us, it helps to sort of put them all on one page and be able to see both sides of those. That's sort of the two pie charts put together. So, I think, and again, I just reiterate that I think the main point for what we've been thinking about in terms of economic security is to recognize that those sort of straight to the bottom line of household supports that we're calling these individual well-being supports, plus the housing piece, is a relatively small share. So I think the bad news is we know we're not doing enough in a lot of these areas. And I think the good news is that sort of reasonable targeted investments can make a really big difference in how, and kind of household bottom lines and how Vermonters are doing. And then just really briefly, I'll touch on how we know we have the resources to make these kind of additional investments in Vermonters' well-being. When we look at our state tax system overall, we're one of the few states in the country where our tax system doesn't make inequality worse, but you can still see that our tax system is somewhat regressive on the top, meaning that the highest top 5% of Vermonters are paying a smaller share of their income and taxes than a lot of the kind of middle class folks in that piece. So there's room to make the system more progressive. And then this is the 100-year view of income inequality, but I think it's helpful to just see, basically for the first 50 years, income inequality was declining, and for the last 50 years, it's been increasing. And so we know that there's sort of a lot more income and wealth is being concentrated at the top, and that our revenue system really isn't keeping up with that level of concentration and that degree of wealth inequality. So that's really kind of the quick overview of what I wanted to share with you and what we've been thinking about. But the last thing I'll say before handing it off to Julie is that, when we thought about that kind of list of the 7 promises that I said at the beginning, I think there's sort of 2 approaches. I think there's some of those promises that we think of in a really comprehensive way, and we try to keep them in a really comprehensive way. And I think public education is one of them, right? It's a system for everybody. It's universal. All kids can access it, similar to our roads or our public parks. They're universal programs. And then with some of these other promises, like housing and food, we approach it more as though we're trying to do the bare minimum, right? We're giving people just enough to survive, if that. And the policy design is really about keeping people out, or maybe or worrying that we're giving people too much, or giving it to the wrong people, or maybe it's just sort of this unwillingness to acknowledge the true cost of what it would take. And we build those policies with a lot of different limits, whether it's tied to individual criteria or just how much we're willing to spend on a particular program, or because we haven't adjusted those programs for inflation over time, so they're no longer sort of capturing the same share of Vermonters or doing what they were originally intended to do. So I think keeping all these promises for real requires sort of more inclusive, universal policies that ensure we're meeting these needs without cliffs and cutoffs. And we know there's the resources to keep all these promises. I think that we know that some of them will take time, but there's also some steps that we could take right away that would really have an immediate impact on families' bottom line. And so I think that's part of what I'm going to hand it off to Julie to talk about, is some of the tax credit work that she's been doing alongside a number of partners to really think about how we can sort of have an immediate effect in improving families' economic security in Vermont. With that, I think Julie's in the room there, so I will stop sharing. And then we're happy to take questions when she's done.
Thanks, Deb.
Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Lowell. I'm the Outreach and Policy Director at Public Assets Institute. And does this sound the right mix of, I don't need to turn on anything.
No.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if
you want to move closer to us, it's gonna, yeah, if you want to. Nice. Thanks. It's just us. It's a very large table.
I'll get that for you. I'll get that
Yeah.
for you.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you for having us. Thanks to Steph for grounding us in kind of some of the overall data points. So I'm going to talk like Steph said about some of these cash resources, but I just want to ground in the way that we've been thinking about economic security, particularly as you're saying, like, what's our vision moving forward? And so really think about what does it mean for everyone in Vermont to have economic security? How do we create a system where we have where people are not falling into poverty at any of life stages, and that they don't have to experience the trauma of not being able to make ends meet, and so that they can really thrive and live the lives they want. And so we've been really conceptualizing this as people having cash resources so they can direct it to where their family needs it. Strong public goods that meet people's needs that might otherwise be out of financial reach and that we've agreed on as a community that we want to provide to everybody. People having access to wealth building, so they can not only meet their basic needs, but they really have the resources to pursue future opportunities and have that mental and physical safety and security, and an equitable economy for paid and unpaid workers, employers, and the public. And so policy plays a role in each of these four areas, but I'm really going to focus in on those cash benefits today. Really looking at where some targeted improvements in these programs that already exist, kind of speaking to that complexity of how do we use the programs in place already to make improvements to help people. And so I'm going to focus on anti-poverty tax credits and reach up. Taking a minute, sorry. So when I talk about anti-poverty tax credits, I'm talking about fully refundable tax credits so that people receive cash back when they file their taxes. Once they've met their tax obligation, any leftover money actually comes back to them in a check so that they can use those funds for however they would like to. So two of our largest in Vermont are the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. These serve nearly 34,000 families with children each year. So I'm just really going to quickly, briefly outline where we are currently with the tax credits, and the Anti-Poverty Tax Credit Coalition has identified a few areas of improvement on those. So first, the Vermont's Earned Income Tax Credit right now is at 38% of the federal Earned Income Tax Credit. And this credit changes based on a family's earnings and the number of children that they have. It also is fully refundable, as I mentioned, and as of last year, the state provides this to everybody in the community who's a resident. And so what that means is that they've lived in the state for 6 months and a day. So this includes folks who might be undocumented in our communities, who are working and paying taxes, and who are not currently eligible for many of the programs that exist in Vermont. So this slide here, it gives you a little bit of a sense of what the credit provides for families. This shows the combination of the state and the federal Earned Income Tax Credit together. So adjusted gross income is along the bottom, and the amount of the EITC is on the left-hand side. The state portion of the credits is about a quarter of what you're seeing here, and a little less than 3/4 of this comes from the federal credit. So you can see for a family with 3 kids or more, this is really meaningful and impactful amounts of money. The child tax credit is a little bit more straightforward. It's a flat credit. It's $1,000 per kid under 6, and it's a nearly universal credit. Around 95% of Vermont kids under 6 receive the credit. It's around 34,000 kids. The families with up to $125,000 income get the full credit. So it's very impactful, again, fully refundable, and available to all Vermont residents who have been here for 6 months and above. So as Steph pointed out, a number of families with children don't have enough to make ends meet in that basic needs budget chart. And in this next chart here, you can see where Vermont's minimum wage leaves families really far from meeting not just the poverty level, but the basic needs level as determined by JFO. So the tax credits currently are already helping to fill in the gap, but we think with some adjustments, they could be even more impactful. And you can see here too, but back to this previous chart, if you look at the maximum benefit for a family with 3 children is almost $9,000, but that's for a family with $25,000 income. So again, that's still leaving that family with close to $35,000, but still quite far from meeting their basic needs. Before I move into kind of the solutions, one other really important thing I want to mention about the credits is they don't interact with other benefits. So for every dollar we can get to families via tax credits, they're not losing other important benefits that sort of stack together to get families closer to meeting their basic needs. So we have, as I mentioned, the Anti-Poverty Tax Credit Coalition is 5 different organizations who have come together to really think about how we can improve on the credits that already exist. The first is that we'd like to expand the amount of the credit. Last year, we had a bill introduced that would increase the state earned income tax credit to 55% of the federal EITC for filers with children. And this would give a family with 1 child up to $679 more each year when they file their taxes. We'd also like to extend Vermont's child tax credit to, right now, it's only for kids under 6. And we recognize there's certain populations who are struggling. I think this just came up in our conversation. Families who have a child of any age with a disability qualify for the earned income tax credit. But if your child has a disability and they're over the age of 6, you don't qualify for the child tax credit anymore. So this feels like a pretty targeted expansion of the credit that would really help people who we know are disproportionately impacted by poverty and have additional expenses. The other thing we'd like to do is create a new tax credit that's targeted to youth transitioning out of the foster care system. So one of the limitations of the current EITC, if you don't have children, you're only eligible for the credit if you're between the ages of 25 and 64. And so we're missing those youth 18 to 24 and those over 65. And foster kids, we know in particular, are sort of economically vulnerable. So if we could have a targeted tax credit towards that group from the ages of 18 to 26, it would be really significant to helping them make ends meet. And then the last piece is really expanding access to their tax credits and making sure that they're easily accessible. And a lot of this work is primarily administrative. There's the opportunity for Vermont's Department of Taxes to sign on to the federal IRS direct file system, which it's a new program in place. They had their first pilot take place into the 2024 filing season. And it allows, if we join, it would allow Vermont filers to file their federal and state taxes for free through an easy to access platform. So it really just help people more easily file their taxes. We'd also really like other state departments to have coordinated messaging about the credits so that they are kind of targeting their messaging towards the people who qualify for the credits, but who might not apply. Because if your incomes are so low that you don't have to file your taxes, you might not, but you do still qualify for these credits. This figure is getting a bit dated, but in 2019, 17% of Vermont filers who were eligible for the EITC federally didn't file for it. That was included 4,500 families who had children and left an average credit of $2,000 on the table for families with 1 child and nearly $4,000 for families with more than 2 children. And that's just the federal EITC. So if we can really get more people to file, it's more support for them and their families. And then the last piece is that we ensure people have access to the credits, even if they owe other state debts. So right now, if you file your taxes and you have a tax credit, if you have other state debts, it's going to get pulled or set off to pay that debt. And we know particularly, both of these are really designated and targeted towards families with children. And so we want those families to have those resources to take care of their kids. So in addition to anti-poverty tax credits, I'm just going to spend a few minutes on Reach Up. I think you're all pretty familiar with the Reach Up program. It helps about 3,500 families a month in 2023 at least, including over 6,000 children. This benefit continues to be kind of plagued with 2 major issues. First, it provides families with less than 50% of what the Department for Children and Families calculates as their basic needs budget. This is the rateable reduction. And it also ties benefits to a basic need line that isn't current. Right? For most basic needs, they use the 2019 calculation, but for housing, they use the 2001 costs. So the calculation is failing in 2 distinct ways. And what that means for families is they receive grants that are around 40% of DCF's bare bones basic needs budget. So as you can see in the next chart, these families fall short of meeting their basic needs, whether you look at Reach Up basic needs estimate or comparison to an adjusted joint fiscal office basic needs estimate. So in this chart, you can see sort of how benefits stack together. And this basic needs estimate for the JFO has been adjusted to exclude healthcare, childcare, rental, and life insurance assistance, because we know those are some benefits that often these families, although as Steph pointed out, not always all the families do qualify for. So to fix this, the Reach Up Basic Needs line should be tied first and foremost to the Joint Fiscal Office Basic Needs line, which creates a common framework in Vermont, begins to tie some of those systems together that are mismatched and not talking with one another. And this is updated every other year in a collected, transparent process, which uses evidence-based methodology. And the state should eliminate the rateable reduction so that Reach Up grant combined with other benefits can really get families to the basic needs level as you think about that original frame of economic security for all, so that policies in each of these areas combine to make sure that families have what they need. So targeted investments in VITC expansion and fixing the pickup formula can really have dramatic impacts for Vermont families. When taken in full context of the state budget, the investments, as Steph was noting, are relatively small, but for these families who receive the support, they really provide meaningful impact. Thank you so much for having us.
That's mine. Any questions or comments about any of that?
Not really a question, but one of the things that we didn't comment on in the policy recommendations, is I think the minimum wage was highlighted originally.
Yes.
To it, it seems like it's an important part of the presentation.
Yeah, and we can also know you also printed submitted, just getting back to economic security in general.
You're talking about the Reach Up recommendations, or is that different?
Right, this, you shared this.
I did, but probably not with the council. I still can send it to Mike right now.
Yeah. Amy's just gonna share something with Mike and post just in the National Center for Children in Poverty. It's kind of Vermont's state profile. Too many papers. Okay. The recommendations just around kind of economic security start on page 14. People want to take a look at those, or I don't know if there is any information that'd be helpful to hear from Steph or Julie about anything they've shared. Otherwise, we can just kind of walk through the economic ones if you want. The first one is just increasing the minimum wage for all workers in Vermont to be consistent with a livable wage, alongside corresponding adjustments and benefit eligibility to avoid perpetuating the benefit cliff. We are seeing annual increases, but we're still nowhere near the living wage in Vermont. It's kind of a topic that wasn't talked about much in the biennium. Myself and another legislator did introduce a bill around looking at the minimum wage again, and also how we support small businesses to kind of move to that minimum wage. But I think with all of the inflation we're experiencing, I do think it's something we need to take another look at in Vermont, and also looking at how we calculate all of these minimums and what percentage. I think all of the percentages are just completely different now, what people are paying for healthcare and housing and just how we calculate who qualifies for what, I think is really lacking in true reality. Minors are experiencing. Paid family and medical leave continues to be a priority, I think, of the House, and not something the Senate has been wanting to take action on. We did just, as legislators, just started to got a little bit of data about the governor's program, paid leave through, I can't think of the name of the company, it's private insurance. But that was, people are using it and they've been making payouts. So it is something, and it sounds like they're hoping to get more employers to buy into this. I think the biggest is it's not universal, and it's not something everyone has access to. So I think there's more work to be done there and making sure everyone has access to paid family and medical leave if they need it.
Is that data available to share, or is it just?
I'm going to check and see if I can share it. Another legislator had reached out and it was shared with them. So made a note to myself. And this is what Karen is talking about, increasing the base funding for economic programs that create jobs and build savings and assets. For example, the Micro Business Development Program and the Vermont Match Savings Program. And a lot around investing and workforce training, financial capability, financial literacy education. Please raise your hand. Oh, yeah. See, there we go. If any of these are things you want to talk about more. I'm wondering how the underrepresented educator affinity groups are going.
Yeah.
And then one thing we haven't talked much about was transportation. And I was actually wondering if you all had any suggestions about someone we might invite to speak. I think transportation is, it's not as much talked about in these, when we talk about these topics, but it's a major barrier to accessing services and tools. You know, especially in rural areas, a huge barrier. And then I know that even in our more like Burlington, especially is struggling to maintain their current level of public transportation that they offer. And so it's something I'm just really concerned about, that we're going to be isolating Vermonters even more.
Yeah, it does feel like a significant barrier. I don't personally know the right person to connect with, but can try to do a little bit of research. I hear about it often. And I also,
I sent some emails out to some of the like kind of district transportation folks, and I will send some more out. Got a lot of autoresponders, which is not surprising this time of year. Yeah.
off topic, so once you're done, I'll give you another, I had a suggestion, so.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, I don't know if you would want to know, but the committee might be interested in hearing from the Department of Mental Health about the new CCBHC initiative, which stands for Certified Community Integrated Health Centers, which is going to be changing in some ways how mental health services get delivered. And we have someone who's in charge of the implementation and has the big picture of where we are and where we're going. So that may be something you want to consider. The person would probably be Lori Vatican, who's I can't remember, Director of Integrated Mental Health.
Can you repeat that last name for me again?
Vatican, Vadakin.
So, I will reach out. That's a good suggestion. And then we get to the supporting funding for tax preparation programs, which we heard about. And it sounds we can do more.
Do more. And I can speak a little bit. Is this an appropriate place?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest this would be the perfect time to talk about. I've heard some about it, but I think for everyone else to hear.
Well, our community action programs do a great job, right?
Yeah.
There's 5 centers across the state regionally, and they help people file their taxes for free. Like in addition to what will come with the direct file, there's also that resource is already in existence and is super helpful. One of the barriers we're finding with that right now is we've done a great job of including folks who are residents who might not have the documentation into this policy umbrella of qualifications, but they are not guaranteed to have support from the community action programs to file their taxes because the VITA programs are funded via the IRS, and the IRS kind of has this catchment and criteria that you have to have the social security number and an alternative tax ID number to use their services. And so we're seeing a bit of a hole. Community action is trying to support those folks, and last spring spun up sort of an alternative entry door, but it continues to be a bit of a capacity issue. So I know that we're seeing access being a really big issue for that population in particular, to make sure that they understand the credits and have support in applying for them.
I don't know if this is a question that can be answered, but are there opportunities to provide protections for people who are undocumented and are eligible for these tax credits in terms of sharing of information?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, it's written really clearly in the Vermont Department of Taxes statute that they would not share information. And there's specific legal language that protects people's confidentiality and anonymity. I think one of the barriers is getting people to believe and trust that. And so I think we're trying to figure out as a coalition the best way to support people and move them forward to getting these benefits that they qualify for. And also making sure that they feel safe in doing it. And I think in some national conversations, I know the conversation is really about how do you securely, if there is indeed a tax collection organization that can be supportive in Vermont, how do they secure people's confidential documents so that so it's not actually the tax department who might be at risk or subpoenaed for information, but it might be a second party actor. Okay. You're quite clear answers to that, but I'm trying to get more information as it comes.
Hand up to it now, you can see.
Oh, yes. Go ahead, Kay.
Where did you see hands? Sorry.
And then,
Oh, go.
okay. Yeah, and then we got to the parts around cash assistance. So we had increasing cash assistance to Vermont's vulnerable families to 100% of basic needs and eliminate the $77 a month penalty for families with an adult who has a disability.
Sounds as though the
Like-
second part has been accomplished.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Partial success, but still more work to be done around cash assistance. And continuing to increase the income disregard and asset limit in the Reach Up program. We've done a little bit of work on the Reach Up, but as we've heard, there's still a lot more to get folks to the amounts they actually need to meet their basic needs. Did you want to go over the information on that document you shared?
I can. I mean, this was created by the Center for Budget and Health, National Center for Children in Poverty, and they, I think, just did a really good job of state by state naming what we have for benefits and giving some considerations in terms of opportunities for improvement. And so they unsurprisingly named the maximum benefit as an area where there could be some work done. And they suggested considering increasing the maximum benefit level and named Minnesota as like one guide who currently uses 62% of the federal poverty level for their benefit, which is considerably more than we have in Vermont. And then as was mentioned by other folks today, they talked about tying the better benefit to either the cost of living or the federal poverty level or another tool. And they named like New Hampshire as an example, who currently uses 60% of the federal poverty level for their benefit. And then they offer some smaller suggestions, which I think were also worth noting, increasing the income limit, eliminating the asset limit. They have consider providing eligibility to low-income pregnant people with no other children from the first month of pregnancy in order to support basic needs required for maternal health and children's early development. We're doing well with our time limits, with our felony ban and with our family cap. But they also suggested considering only reducing the benefit amount when that happens for adults, so that children continue to receive their full assistance. So when we decrease benefits because of failure to meet a goal of Reach Up, some states have opted to only penalize the adult in the household and not the children in those reductions, and that can just kind of retain the money for children. We did, you passed the bill last biennium to kind of map out what it would take to eliminate the fatal reduction over 5 years. And
Yes.
so my perspective is we're already on that path, and that might be logical, reasonable action item is to continue to move to kind of make up for last year where there wasn't a financial shift, and then to kind of catch back up and work towards a fatal reduction.
Yes, that was my first bill I presented on the floor. Great. Well, from here, we can, if folks have thought of other ideas or things they're seeing emerging as priorities, we have a little bit more time. Yeah, Olivia.
I wonder if I'm just looking at like family supports and trauma and thinking broadly, I wonder if we should try to hear from an immigrants rights organization. Just especially considering like mixed status families and the fears that they're undergoing right now. or really any immigrant families, just trying to think about how we might be able to support or what we should be considering.
Thank you for that suggestion. Yeah. Should we add them? Any other suggestions, or we can end a little early. I know it's getting.
Nope, so, I dug up the agenda from the last offsite meeting we did that
Okay.
night in Rutland. And part of it was, discussion at small tables and small groups. Discussion at tables, and these
Yeah.
were the questions that they asked. I didn't know if you wanted to
Yep.
update those or keep them the same or what.
Excellent suggestion for last little bit of time. Okay, so I don't know if you all heard that, or here, Sarita, why don't you go? No, we'll move on.
I was just gonna suggest when we talk about transportation, that maybe Molly Burke, who's on the transportation committee, or Sarah Coffey, who is the past chair of the transportation committee, come in and at least talk about what are some of their projected projects, that there are legislation that they're going to be looking at next session, and see how possibly they could incorporate some of our recommendations.
Thank you, Sarita. It's a great suggestion.
And I just want to say, I
Yeah.
am very concerned about undocumented workers in Vermont having any of their identification on any kind of Social Security or any kind of way that the federal government could access that information to find out about undocumented workers in Vermont. I know in the education committee, we were working with VSAC so that they could get some relief for tuition for their children to go to UVM or community college. And the Scott Giles, who runs VSAC, was very concerned about having their information on a database that the federal government could access. So just to keep that in mind.
Sarita, I will connect with you offline. We have a very large group of legislators who are very concerned about that and are working on some possible solutions and meeting with lawyers. And yeah, there's a lot in flux, but I'm happy to connect with you around that. Let's do Kaya, and then we'll go over just kind of discussion topics for our evening meeting.
So one thing that I thought of, because I was involved in earlier this year, is the flood response and how it's affected really negatively, especially families who are living in poverty. Everything from individual families to infrastructure. I mean, so many of our roads I never realized how many of our roads are private, which means that people who live on that road are responsible for the repairs. And it's definitely a big lift that's going on. And it's something we should probably think about.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so at the last evening event, offsite events, they had discussion at tables and small groups, and the 3 questions they asked folks to talk about was, what do you think are the biggest challenges facing Vermonters in poverty today? 2, from your experience and perspective, what works well to help lift Vermonters out of poverty? And 3, from your experience and perspective, what does not work well and could be improved? So how do folks feel about those questions? Should we try and develop new ones? Or do you think those are okay? Are there folks who are interested, if you do think we should develop new ones, who may maybe have a smaller group meeting? What are folks' thoughts? Especially those who may have been in attendance and have some.
Just pop the questions
Experience.
in the meeting chat too, so people can read them.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Do you want to look at them? Okay. Let's see, that was. Okay, great. And if folks are brains have had enough for the day, I will send these out in an email. I just in my own personally, I'm wanting to think about it a little bit and I can't wordsmith right now. So I'm going to follow up with an email and just give folks a time to sit with it a little bit. And then we can think about what we want to do. But we will want to make a decision fairly quickly so Mike can get rolling on planning. Okay, great. Well, does anyone have anything final to say? Otherwise, I will let you all go and see you on December 12th at 10 a.m. Okay. Take care, everybody. Drive safe, those of you who have to be out on the roads. And I hope you all have